There is a photograph that Eleanor Marsh carried in her purse for an entire year. Not in a wallet sleeve or a frame, just loose in the
This
bottom
is
of her
just
purse, where
lovely,
her
isn't
fingers
it?
would find
It
it when
is.
she
We're good
reached for her
friends.
keys or her reading
And good
glasses or the
times.
small folding tape measure she had carried every day for 42 years. The photograph was taken in 1972. She's wearing a suit jacket borrowed from her older brother. The shoulders slightly too wide, the sleeves landing just above her wrists. The man beside her is wearing a vest his mother pressed the night before, and he is looking at her instead of the camera. The way people look at something they cannot quite believe belongs to them. Both of them are grinning. Not the careful smiles of people who know a camera is watching, but the open, unguarded grin of two people who have just made a decision they are absolutely certain about. She did not know when she slipped that photograph into her purse on a Saturday morning in March that she would be carrying it through a motel parking lot with broken asphalt and a church fellowship hall smelling of old coffee and 12 miles of gravel road leading nowhere anyone had bothered to go in 30 years. She did not know it would become the one object she refused to let out of her sight. Not because it was beautiful, though it was, but because it was proof. Proof that she had once stood in a borrowed jacket and known exactly where she was going. Eleanor Marsh was 76 years old. She had been a carpenter for 42 years, starting at 14 in her father's small woodworking shop in the county's eastern end, learning to read grain and set a blade, and listen to what a piece of wood wanted to become before she forced it into something else. She was one of the very few women in construction trades in her region during the years when that fact required daily proof of competence, when her presence on a job site prompted looks that she answered not with words, but with the quality of her joints and the plumb of her walls. Her hands carried all of it, the calluses built layer upon layer across her palms, the scar crossing her right knuckle from a router that kicked in 1979, the index finger on her left hand, that bent slightly outward at the second joint from a break in 1981, that she had not gotten properly set because she could not afford to lose 2 days of work. She had built her first bookshelf at 14 and had not stopped building after that. Her husband, Walter Marsh, had spent 35 years teaching third grade at Millbrook Elementary. He was the kind of teacher who stayed late, who spent his own money on classroom supplies without mentioning it, who learned every child's name by the second day of school and remembered them years later when those children passed him in the grocery store. He was 73, 3 years younger than Eleanor, with the particular patience of a man who had spent decades making complicated things clear to 8-year-olds without ever making the 8-year-olds feel small for not already knowing. When he retired, the school gave him a plaque and a sheet cake. He gave the cake to the neighbors and kept the plaque in a drawer because display had never been his instinct. They had raised 3 children in a 4-bedroom house on Barker Street. Nothing extravagant. A house Eleanor had worked on continually over the decades, rebuilding the porch twice, adding insulation to the attic in 1994, replacing the kitchen floor when the boards began to soften at the edges. She had replaced the roof 3 times and had been planning the 4th. Walt had kept the household running with the same steady competence he brought to everything, managing the finances, carefully keeping the arguments short, filling the kitchen with the smell of whatever he was teaching himself to cook that season. They had not been wealthy. They had been the kind of people who understood the difference between enough and plenty, and were grateful for the first without pining after the second. Their eldest child, Brandon, had known from his sophomore year in high school that he was built for larger things than the street he had grown up on. He was driven and perceptive and impatient with limitation in ways that Eleanor had recognized as her own qualities, pushing through a different temperament. She and Walt had refinanced the house to pay for his undergraduate degree, and Eleanor had taken weekend jobs finishing furniture for a local millwork company, while Walt tutored during summers. Brandon had graduated, moved into commercial real estate development, and built a life that by any external measure was successful. A corner office, a car that was replaced every 2 years, a house in a city 3 hours south with rooms he had never found a use for. He came home for Thanksgiving in some years, and Christmas in others, and called on birthdays with enough regularity that his absence the rest of the year had never accumulated into anything either of them named out loud. Their daughter Diane, the middle child, had become an accountant. She was careful and methodical and had settled with her husband 2 towns away, where she was raising a son of 9 and a daughter of 7. She called on Sunday evenings usually and had visited with reasonable frequency until the visits became less frequent without either side acknowledging it. Their youngest, Tyler, had gone into software, moved to the West Coast, and had become progressively harder to reach as the years collected. Eleanor had stopped trying to understand why and had simply accepted that some people carry the place they came from differently than others. The first sign that something was changing had come 2 years earlier, when Eleanor noticed that Walt was moving more slowly on the stairs. Not dramatically, not in a way that required a conversation, but she had been watching the man for more than 4 decades, and she knew his pace the way she knew the sound of a well-set joint, and something in it had shifted. She had mentioned it to Brandon in passing the following spring, the way she might mention that the gutters needed clearing, offering information without urgency. Brandon had said he would look into options. He looked into options for 2 years. On a Saturday morning in early March, Brandon's black SUV appeared in the driveway. He had not visited in 8 months. He had brought Diane with him. Tyler, he explained, was tied up with a project deadline and sent his regrets. They stood in the kitchen where Walt had cooked 10,000 meals, and Brandon spoke with the confidence of someone who had thought through all the objections in advance and pre-answered them. "We found a place for you." The words landed in the kitchen like something dropped. "It's a good facility. Clean, well-reviewed staff ratios that actually make sense. You'll be comfortable there." Walt set his coffee cup down on the counter with deliberate care. "A facility. It's temporary." Brandon's voice carried the practiced reasonableness of a man accustomed to making unfavorable terms sound rational. "Just until we work out the house situation. The property taxes went up significantly again, and with the medical expenses we've been tracking, the numbers don't support maintaining the property." "What numbers?" Eleanor stepped fully into the kitchen from the doorway where she had been standing. "We have never once sat down with you and gone over any numbers." Brandon moved through his explanation with the momentum of someone who had rehearsed it. "Property maintenance costs, insurance adjustments. The burden of upkeep at their age, the benefits of having professional care available." Eleanor listened to all of it. She had spent 42 years on job sites, learning to read the substructure beneath the surface of things, and what she heard beneath Brandon's reasonable language was not concern. It was conclusion. The decision had already been made, and this conversation was not negotiation, but notification. She looked past Brandon's shoulder at Diane, who was standing near the doorway with her arms folded and her eyes directed at the floor. And something old and specific moved through Eleanor's chest. Walt had always been the one who read faces. 35 years of children had given him the ability to know immediately when a child was hiding something, when the downcast expression was guilt rather than shyness, when the careful posture was shame rather than attention. But Eleanor had been watching her own children for decades, and she knew what Diane's stillness meant. Diane knew. She had known before she drove here. She had known, and she had come anyway, and she was going to say nothing. "We're not going to a facility, Walt said from the doorway now. "Dad, be reasonable." "I am being reasonable. This is our home. Eleanor built half of it with her own hands. I taught school for 35 years, and we raised 3 children in this house, and we are not going to a facility because the numbers don't work for you." Brandon rubbed the back of his neck. "It's temporary, a few weeks, maybe a month, just until we sort things out." Eleanor watched her son's face. She saw the particular way his eyes moved slightly left when he finished speaking, the micro-adjustment of a man who had just said something he was not certain of. She had seen that same tell in him at 11 years old, when he had broken a window playing ball and constructed an elaborate explanation involving wind and a neighbor's cat. She saw it now. But Walt believed him. Walt, who had never broken a promise in 42 years of marriage, who had built his understanding of the world on the assumption that people meant what they said, could not assemble the evidence into the conclusion that his own son was managing them out of his life. Eleanor could see that too, and she did not correct it. Not then. What Walt needed was the mercy of not knowing for at least a little while longer. So she packed 2 suitcases. She moved through the house with the efficiency of someone who had learned not to carry more than necessary, choosing clothes and medications, and the small folding tape measure, and her reading glasses, and a box cutter, and a short pry bar wrapped in a shop rag. Walt packed his books and his clothes and the reading glasses Eleanor had bought him for his birthday 2 years ago. And at the last moment, he went back to the bedroom and took the photograph from the frame on the dresser, sliding it into the breast pocket of his jacket. He did not explain why. Eleanor did not ask. Brandon drove them to the Pine Valley Extended Stay Motel, 11 miles from their house, on a highway that connected nothing in particular to nothing in particular. The sign out front was missing 2 letters. The parking lot had 4 visible potholes and one that was more of a subsidence. Brandon helped carry the suitcases to the room, which smelled of industrial cleaner and something underneath the cleaner that the cleaner had not managed to cover. The carpet was the color of a decision made in 1987 and not revisited. The heating unit against the wall made a sound like someone clearing their throat repeatedly. "This is temporary," Brandon said in the doorway with both hands in his pockets. "I'll call you this week." He pulled the door closed behind him. Eleanor stood in the center of the room and listened to his footsteps on the exterior walkway, and then the sound of his car starting in the parking lot, and then nothing. Walt sat on the edge of the bed nearest the window. He sat with his hands on his knees, looking at the middle distance the way a person looks when they are waiting for something to resolve into a shape they recognize. "He'll call," he said. He said he'd sort it out. Eleanor sat beside him. She did not say anything. She took his hand and held it. The motel cost $89 a week cash only. Their total was $220. Eleanor did the arithmetic without paper. She had been doing construction estimates in her head for 4 decades, and the numbers here were not complicated. At $89 a week with reasonable food expenses, they had slightly over 2 weeks. She identified the constraint and set it aside to think about what could extend it. On the second day, she noticed the hinge on the door of room 11 was bent in a way that caused the door to drag against the frame. She borrowed a screwdriver from the maintenance closet, removed the hinge plate, bent it back with a piece of pipe she found propped against the exterior stairwell, and reinstalled it. The door swung clean. The woman who managed the property, whose name was Carol, a tired-faced woman in her early 50s, who had clearly been managing people's problems for a long time, noticed and asked Eleanor if she could look at a threshold that had warped on the ground floor. Eleanor fixed it. Carol adjusted their bill by 2 nights. That was the beginning of the transaction that would carry them for the first 2 weeks Eleanor's labor for small reductions in what they owed. It was not enough, but it changed the rate of depletion, which was what mattered. Walt called Brandon on the 3rd day. The call went to voicemail. He called again on the 7th day. Voicemail. On the 9th day, he called Diane, who answered, who apologized in the abbreviated way of someone apologizing for a situation they were not going to change, and who said she would talk to Brandon. Walt told Eleanor she had promised to talk to Brandon. Eleanor nodded and said nothing more about it. Tyler's number had been disconnected. Eleanor discovered this when she tried it on the 5th day. She sat with that fact for a while, turning it over the way she turned over a piece of wood to understand its grain, before deciding where to cut. Then she put the phone down and went to fix the lock on room 7, which Carol had mentioned in passing. The second week cost them $61 after Eliana's labor credits. They had $41 when the second week ended. Walt bought bread and peanut butter from the gas station across the road. Eleanor bought coffee. They were careful, but $41 at any rate was not an extended runway. The night before the money ran out, they sat on the 2 chairs beside the window and Walt put the photograph on the small table between them. They sat with it for a while without speaking. Outside, a gas station sign across the road flickered, one of its elements failing. "We could try the church," Walt said. Eleanor had been thinking about the church since the previous afternoon. She had passed a building 2 blocks from the motel, white clapboard, a sign out front listing service times and a food pantry schedule. "I don't want to take charity." Walt's voice had something careful in it. The particular gentleness of a man who had spent 35 years finding the words that would land without bruising. "Eleanor, we are sitting in a motel room on chairs that are bolted to the floor, and our son has not called in 9 days, and we have $41. I think we may be in the category of people that charity was designed for." She looked at him. After 42 years, she could read his face the way she read structural drawings, knowing exactly where the weight was and where the reinforcement sat. There was no self-pity in what he had said. There was only precision. He was describing their situation accurately, and accuracy had always been the thing she valued most in him. "In the morning," she said. The pastor at First Methodist was a man named Gideon, somewhere in his mid-50s, with the bearing of someone who had heard enough difficult things to have stopped being surprised by them without ever becoming indifferent. He listened to Walt explain their situation, and he did not make them feel small for being there. He said he could put them up in the fellowship hall for 2 nights on cots, and that after that he had a list of shelters in the county that might be able to help. Eleanor took the list. She held it in her hands and looked at the names typed on it. County Emergency Housing Transitional Shelter, a Women's Resource Center, 2 church-affiliated programs with waiting lists. She had built houses for other people for 4 decades. The list was a document, and documents described reality. And reality was what you started from, not what you surrendered to. In the morning, Walt dressed and walked 2 blocks to the county administrative building. He was a teacher. He had spent 35 years navigating bureaucratic systems on behalf of children who could not navigate them for themselves. Understanding that the right question asked of the right person at the right desk could produce results that seemed unavailable from the outside. He went to the property records office and he told the clerk, a young woman named Carla, who wore her hair pulled back and had the efficient manner of someone who processed 100 requests a week. Exactly what they were: 2 people who needed a place to live and had almost no money. Carla frowned at her screen. She typed. She frowned again. "There's a tax sale listing that's been sitting in the system for years. Nobody's made an offer on it." She hesitated before continuing. "It's an old county jail, out on Hadley Road about 12 miles east, abandoned since the early 90s. Walt kept his expression neutral, the way he had learned to do when a child presented an answer he had not expected and needed a moment to understand it. "How much?" $6, that's the county minimum for tax sale property." "What's the condition?" Carla looked at her screen for a moment longer than necessary. "It's standing," she said. "That's about as much as I can tell you." Walt walked back to the fellowship hall and found Eleanor sitting on her cot with her hands in her lap waiting. She had the particular stillness of a person who has exhausted the small occupations of waiting and arrived at simple endurance. He sat down across from her and told her what Carla had said. He watched Eleanor's face while he talked, processing it the way she processed everything. Structural, looking for the load-bearing elements beneath the description. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Is it still standing?" "That's what she said." Eleanor stood up. She reached for her jacket and put it on. "I want to see it." Pastor Gideon drove them out that afternoon in his aging Buick down 12 miles of state highway, and then a turn onto a road that began as cracked asphalt and became gravel within a quarter mile, the gravel narrowing between overgrown drainage ditches and fence posts that leaned at angles suggesting decades of unchallenged neglect. The gravel continued for another mile past the last visible structure before ending abruptly in a cleared area where the land flattened and the scrub grass grew in patches around a central object that the landscape seemed to be slowly digesting. The jail was 2 stories of grey limestone block, with a flat roofline and barred windows on every visible face. The front entrance was flanked by 2 concrete pillars that had separated from their bases and settled outward at slight angles over the years. A length of chain hung across the front entrance, its padlock frozen open with rust. The steps leading up to the entrance had weeds growing through the cracks. The building had the specific quality of abandonment that is different from decay, not collapsing, not giving up, simply waiting with the indifference of something that had been built to outlast the purposes it was built for. Eleanor got out of the car before Gideon had fully stopped. She walked the perimeter of the building without speaking, moving along the foundation, stopping to press her palm flat against the stone at intervals, pausing at each corner to look upward along the vertical lines of the walls. She crouched at the northeast corner, where the foundation met the ground, and examined the joint between the limestone block and the soil. She stood and looked at the roofline from different angles, assessing its sag. She walked to the south face and looked at the windows, testing the iron bars on the nearest one, pulling and releasing, noting the resistance. Then she disappeared around the back of the building. Walt pushed open the front entrance and stepped inside. The corridor stretched straight ahead, with cells lining both sides, 6 on each side, their iron bar fronts intact and unchanged, their interiors visible as small rectangular spaces with stone walls on 3 sides and a single small window opposite the bars. The ceiling was high, perhaps 10 feet, with exposed conduit running along the top. Near the entrance, a processing desk sat against the wall beneath a bulletin board, still holding a single faded notice dated 1993. He walked to the nearest cell and placed his hand on the bars. They were cold and they did not move. He looked into the cell, 8 feet deep by 10 feet wide, he estimated. The floor was concrete stained but level. The walls were solid limestone. The ceiling was intact. Eleanor came in through the front entrance. She walked the length of the corridor without stopping, looking upward at the ceiling, and Walt could see her eyes moving from joist to conduit to wall junction in the sequence of someone doing a rapid structural assessment. She stopped at the far end and turned and walked back toward him. She stopped at the cell where he was standing. She put her hand on the bars next to his, tested them as he had looked into the space. "Walls are dry," she said. "Floors level. Those 2 spots on the ceiling are old water damage contained." She moved her hand along the bar she was holding. "This is solid iron bolted into limestone. It's not going anywhere. It's a jail, Eleanor." She turned and looked at him with the particular expression she had when she had already solved a problem and was waiting for him to arrive at the same place. "It's $6, and it's ours if we want it. We raised 3 children in a 4-bedroom house. I think we can manage a few jail cells." Walt looked at Eleanor standing beside him, with her hand on the iron. The woman he had stood next to for more than 4 decades, who had been the one everyone deferred to when a question needed an answer. He took his wallet from his pocket and counted out $6 in bills. He held them out to Pastor Gideon, who had followed them inside and was standing a few feet back. "Would you mind dropping these at the county property office on your way back?" Gideon looked at the money. He looked at the jail. He looked at Walt and then at Eleanor. "Are you certain about this?" Walt looked at Eleanor, who was already walking back toward the entrance, already thinking about what came next. "I'm certain about her," he said. They spent the first night on the concrete floor of the cell closest to the front entrance. Eleanor wedged the exterior door shut with a piece of scrap lumber she found in the corridor. She laid their coats on the floor, folded a shirt from her suitcase into a rough pillow, and they settled onto the concrete as the November dark came down and the temperature inside the building became genuinely cold. The wind outside moved through gaps in the broken windows and created a low, irregular tone in the corridor. Not eerie, not threatening. Simply present the sound of a space that had been without inhabitants for a long time and had not yet adjusted to having them. Walt lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling. and listened to the building exist around them. He was 73 years old and had been sleeping in a real bed for all of those years. And the difference between a real bed and a concrete floor in November was not a small one. He thought about all the nights he had prepared lesson plans at the kitchen table on Barker Street with the lamp on, and the house quiet around him, about the specific texture of ordinary life that he had not known he was in until it was gone. Then he heard Eleanor moving. He turned his head and watched her silhouette in the thin moonlight that came through the barred window. She had opened her suitcase and was doing something with the lining, a steady, purposeful movement in the dark that did not have the quality of restlessness. He heard fabric tear a clean, deliberate sound. He heard the small metallic note of her fingers finding the bars of the cell's front. He watched her tie something across the space between two of the bars, pulling it taut, adjusting the tension, stepping back to look. The fabric was burgundy, and it hung across the lower portion of the barred opening like a curtain, small, partial. It covered perhaps 18 inches of the bars, but it was there, and it changed the space, and she had made it from what was available with the same practical intelligence she brought to everything. She stepped back and looked at it. "There," she said quietly. "Now it's a window." He looked at her standing in the dark of an abandoned county jail, and he felt something move through him that was not despair and not hope, but something older than either of them. Something that had to do with the specific gravity of a person who does not stop working on the problem in front of them, regardless of what the problem is or how far it is from anything they had planned for. She was 76 years old and she had $5 and she was hanging curtains. He reached out his hand. She found it in the dark and sat down beside him, and he held it and did not say anything because there was nothing to say that would be equal to what she had just done. Outside, the wind moved across the county past everything that had brought them here. The building made its sounds around them. Walt closed his eyes. He slept. Eleanor was awake before first light. She rose carefully and walked the length of the corridor in the gray pre-dawn dark, counting paces, looking upward at the ceiling, stopping to examine the conduit runs. She found the storage closet at the far end of the first-floor corridor, a low door she had to duck to pass through, and inside it she found a rusted toolbox with a claw hammer, a handsaw with a blade that had lost its set but still had teeth, a level with a bubble that was slow but honest, and a gallon coffee can filled with nails and screws and small hardware of varying vintages. She stood in that closet in the gray light of a November morning and looked at what was there. Then she went back to the corridor and sat on the cold concrete with her back against the wall and took the folded grocery receipt from her jacket pocket and began to write. The list was not short. She did not make it shorter by omitting things that were true. Every item she wrote was something the building needed before it could hold people safely through a winter. When she had written everything she could identify by walking the building in near darkness, she turned the receipt over and started a second list. What was already here? What could be salvaged? What could be made from what was salvaged? What would need to be bought? The second list was shorter.
This is
But it
just
was not
lovely,
empty.
isn't it?
Walt came
It
out of
is
the
to
cell
good friends
when the light had strengthened
And good
enough to
times.
see clearly. He found her sitting against the wall with two pieces of paper on her knees. He looked at her face, which had the focused calm of someone who has moved through the hardest part of a problem and come out the other side with the plan. "How bad is it?" he
Oh, my
asked.
love, you
She
haven't
handed him the
changed a
first
bit.
list and watched him
I
read
can
it.
still see
He
that
read it through
sparkle in
once,
your
then again,
eyes.
then looked at her. She held up the second list. He took his wallet from his pocket and removed the $5 bill that was the last of what they had. He held it out toward her. Eleanor looked at the bill. She looked at the two lists. She looked at the building around them. Its limestone walls solid and dry, its bones as sound as anything she had ever worked on, its possibilities laid out in her handwriting on the back of a gas station receipt. "Then we start with what's already here," she said. The first useful thing Eleanor found beyond the toolbox was 18 steel bars she had not paid for. The interior of the building had a dividing partition in the processing area near the entrance, a wall of vertical steel rods bolted floor to ceiling that had once separated the intake desk from the corridor leading to the cells. The rods were solid, approximately an inch in diameter, and the bolts holding them had loosened with 3 decades of thermal expansion and contraction. She spent most of the first full day working them free with the pry bar from the storage closet, and by evening she had a pile of 18 steel rods, each 4 feet long, leaning against the outside wall of the building in the thin November light. The wheelbarrow was behind the building, half buried in vegetation that had grown up around it over the years. Its wheel flat and its basin rusted, but structurally intact. She dug it free, pumped the tire with a hand pump she found in the same tangle of equipment, and loaded the rods into it the following morning. She pushed it to the road and waited. A truck came along after roughly 20 minutes, a blue pickup, moving at the easy pace of someone with local knowledge of every pothole. The driver was a man named Doug, a farmer, heading into town, who looked at Eleanor standing on the gravel road with a wheelbarrow full of steel rods and asked exactly one question before agreeing to take her. "Scrapyard on Route 9 still what you need?" She confirmed that it was. He drove her there and waited in the lot while she conducted her business and drove her back when it was done, leaving her at the end of the gravel road with $62 in her pocket and the empty wheelbarrow. That transaction was the first evidence of something Eleanor would come to understand more fully over the following weeks: that the county had a texture of mutual assistance built into it that operated below the level of formal charity, a network of small accommodations between people who recognized necessity when they saw it and did not require an explanation before responding to it. She walked into Hobbs Hardware with $67, 5 of which had been in Walt's wallet, and 62 of which had come from Doug's trip to the scrapyard. Ray Hobbs was behind the counter reading an invoice when she came in, a compact man with forearms built by decades of physical work and a face that had spent considerable time outdoors in all seasons. She put her list on the counter and told him how much she had and what she needed to accomplish with it, and watched him read through the items without expression. He looked up from that list at her hands, the way tradespeople sometimes looked at each other's hands as a form of credentialing, reading the history written there. His eyes moved from the calluses to the scar on her right knuckle to the index finger on her left hand that sat slightly out of true. He did not say anything about what he saw. He folded the list, put it in his shirt pocket, and walked her through the store, pulling items from shelves, lumber offcuts from cut orders that would otherwise go to the burn pile, a box of mismatched fasteners, a partial roll of wire, 2 pipe fittings that had been pulled for a job and were the wrong size but close enough to be adapted. When they got to the register, the total he gave her was $67. Eleanor knew it was wrong. The lumber alone was worth more than $67. She knew it, and he knew she knew it. "I'll pay you back the difference when I have it," she told him. Ray looked at her with the level expression of a man who had already made his decision and did not intend to revisit it. No difference to pay. Those were clearance items. He put the bags on the counter, and that was the end of the conversation on the subject. Then, while she was organizing what she had bought, "My mother did finish carpentry, best work in the county for 20 years. Nobody outside the trade knew her name." He said it the way people say things they have been carrying for a while, not as an opening to discussion, but as a piece of information offered without expectation. Eleanor looked at him for a moment, then picked up her bags and walked out. He called after her as she reached the door. "Come back when you need more. I always have clearance items." The 3 miles back to the building took her 2 hours. Her left knee had been giving her trouble since a fall 2 years earlier, and the gravel road did not improve its opinion of the journey. She stopped twice, setting the bags down and standing in the thin autumn light with her hands on her hips, and each time she looked at what she was carrying and the direction she was going and continued. Walt met her at the edge of the clearing with a cup of water from the hand pump he had spent the previous afternoon rehabilitating. The water was cold and clean. Walt had been busy in her absence in the particular way that was his own, not building, but preparing the conditions for building. He had swept the entire first-floor corridor, with a broom he had constructed from a thick branch and a bundle of dried grass bound with a length of wire. He had cleaned the processing desk until the wood grain showed through the accumulated grime. He had collected every piece of broken glass and debris and piled it outside the front entrance. The corridor smelled of cold air and old stone rather than of accumulated neglect, and the difference was not small. He had also found the well behind the building and spent an hour working the hand pump until the water ran clear. Eleanor started on the first cell that evening and worked until the light failed. She removed the iron bars from the front of the nearest cell, using the pry bar keeping the frame intact. She fitted a length of salvaged lumber across the opening as a header mortised the ends into the stone with a technique that required more time than a nail gun, but produced a joint that would hold for decades. She used 4 of the steel rods to build a simple frame for a door, which she hung on hinges she had extracted from the storage closet. The door opened inward. It latched from the inside. She built a bed frame from the lumber offcuts, and Walt washed the walls of the cell with well water and a cloth torn from a shirt. Eleanor drove a short length of rod into the wall as a bracket and set a piece of board across it as a shelf. Walt placed the photograph on the shelf. They stood in the doorway and looked at what the cell had become. 8 feet by 10 feet with a door that latched from the inside and a shelf with one thing on it. "It's not much," Eleanor said. "It's ours," Walt said. "That makes it plenty." The first person to come was a woman named Helen, who owned the diner on the town's main street. She had heard about them from the pastor, who had heard from Ray Hobbs, who had apparently been mentioning their situation to customers with the understated efficiency of someone who had decided to do something and was doing it sideways. Helen arrived in her station wagon on a Tuesday afternoon with a cardboard box of blankets and a paper bag of canned goods. Walt was the one who saw her from the corridor and went to the entrance. Helen held the box out toward him with the directness of someone who had decided not to make anything awkward. "I heard about you. I brought some things." Walt opened his mouth and she continued before he could form a response. "Don't tell me you don't need them." He did not tell her that. He accepted the box and the bag and asked if she would like to come in and see what they were doing. She came in and walked the corridor and looked at the converted cell and the broom Walt had made and the hand pump visible through the back door and Eleanor's workbench assembled from sawhorses and a salvaged board. When she left, she told 3 people. Within a week, a bag of potatoes appeared on the front step. Then a dozen eggs. Then a retired electrician named Gene drove out, looked at the wiring situation and drove away without comment. He returned the next day with cable and junction boxes and spent the better part of 2 days running wire through the conduit that was already in the walls. The electrical reconnection required paperwork and a fee. Gene handled the first and a church in town covered the second. 3 days of process and then there was power. The evening Gene finished running the final connection and told Walt to try the switch at the far end of the corridor. Eleanor was standing at the other end with a bar clamp in one hand, having just set the frame of the 4th cell's door. She did not know what Walt was about to do. She was thinking about the angle of the hinge pin. Walt flipped the switch. Light ran the length of the corridor from end to end, yellow and steady and real, pushing back the gray November dimness that had been their constant condition since the first night. Eleanor did not look up immediately. She held the clamp where it was waiting for the joint to set, and Walt watched her shoulders from 50 feet away. He saw them rise and then fall in a single slow movement that had nothing to do with breathing mechanics. He had been married to her for long enough to know what that movement meant and what it cost her to make it invisible, and he turned back to the switch and did not say anything about it because she would not have wanted him to. She looked up. "Good," she said. Then she turned back to the door frame. Maya arrived on a Tuesday evening in early December, 6 weeks after Eleanor and Walt had laid down on the concrete floor for their first night. Walt was at the makeshift kitchen counter warming soup on the propane camp stove that Helen had brought out the previous week. And he heard footsteps on the gravel outside, slow and slightly uneven, the walk of someone who was tired. or hurt, or both. She was in her mid-20s, slight except for the visible pregnancy that pulled her jacket forward with dark hair coming loose from a ponytail and a backpack over one shoulder. The bruise along her jawline had aged into the yellow-green stage that meant it was a week or more old, which told Walt something about the timeline of whatever she had left. Her free hand rested against her abdomen in the unconscious protective gesture he had seen before. "I'm sorry to bother you. My car broke down about a mile back. I just saw the light." She looked past him into the corridor, and he watched her take in the stone walls and the wooden doors and the warm light and the smell of soup, and he saw her recalibrate the way people recalibrated when reality did not match the story they had prepared for. "Is this a jail?" "It used to be. Now it's a home. Come sit down." She ate 2 bowls of soup and 3 pieces of bread, while Walt talked about the garden he was planning for the exercise yard in the spring and the donated refrigerator that produced a sound like a small animal when the compressor cycled on. He kept his questions minimal and his conversation gentle, understanding from 35 years of children that people talked when they were ready and not before. Her name was Maya. She did not offer a last name. She had left somewhere in a hurry, and her plan had dissolved when the car had. She was 6 months along. Eleanor came in from the second floor, where she had been assessing the structural condition of the ceiling joists. She looked at Maya, once taking in the same details Walt had taken in, and then she looked at Walt with an expression that required no translation and went to get another bowl. Later that night, after Maya had gone to sleep in the cell Walt had made up for her, Eleanor went into the adjacent cell with a tape measure and a pencil and began laying out dimensions for a bed frame with a lower profile one that would not require the kind of climb that became difficult in the later months of pregnancy. She did not announce what she was doing. She measured and sketched and went to bed. Clarence came 3 days after Maya. He was 81 with a face that had been worn by weather and time into something that looked like it had been there for a long while and planned to remain. His wife had died 2 years earlier. The medical bills that followed had taken the house by degrees, first the equity and then the deed, and he had been sleeping in his car in the parking lot of First Methodist for 3 months, before Ray Hobbs mentioned during a transaction involving a box of wood screws that there was a place on Hadley Road that kept the door open. He stood in the corridor with his hat in both hands and looked at Eleanor and asked if there was room. Eleanor looked down the corridor at the cells she had converted, all but 2 of them, waiting empty. She told him to pick whichever one he liked. She said it the way she said most things, without ceremony, as a statement of fact rather than an offer of charity. And Clarence heard the difference and picked the cell nearest the kitchen. Eleanor said nothing, but the following morning she added a low shelf to Clarence's room, positioned at a height that would not require bending. That evening, 4 people sat at the table Eleanor had built from salvaged planks and ate dinner together. Nobody named what they were doing. It was simply people in a building on a gravel road at a table someone had built from scrap eating food. Some of them had bought, and some had been given, and all of them needed. Dylan showed up 9 days after Clarence. He was 17, thin in the particular way of someone who had been inconsistently fed, wearing a gray hoodie and carrying a duffel bag that was not entirely full. He stood at the end of the gravel road for nearly an hour before walking toward the building, and Walt saw him from the kitchen window and recognized the specific posture of someone who needed something and was trying to calculate the cost of asking for it. Walt waited. He washed the breakfast dishes and dried them and stacked them on the shelf Eleanor had built into the kitchen wall. And he did not go to the door because he had learned in 35 years with children that the approach had to be the person's own, or the threshold meant nothing. When Dylan finally knocked and Walt opened the door, Dylan asked in the flat voice of someone who had rehearsed the question until the need was no longer audible in it whether it was true that they took people in. Walt told him they had rooms and asked him to come in. Dylan had been kicked out 2 months earlier. He had moved through a sequence of floors and couches that had finally run out the previous week, and he had heard about the building from a girl at the public library who had heard about it from someone at the church. He was 4 months short of his 18th birthday and had not been in a classroom in 2 years. He went upstairs to the room Walt showed him on the second floor and stood in it for a while without saying anything. Then, this was a cell. Walt told him it was. Dylan looked at the walls and the window and the door that latched from the inside. Feels safer than most places I've been sleeping. Walt left him to settle in. Coming back downstairs, he found Eleanor at the kitchen table with a piece of cardboard and a pencil sketching something. He looked over her shoulder. It was a table, longer than the one they had. He studied the dimensions she had marked. "You think more people are coming?" Eleanor did not look up from the sketch. "I think we stopped asking that question about 2 weeks ago." She built the new table over the following 3 days, 8 feet long from lumber. Ray had sent out with a farmer making a delivery run past the turnoff. It was the best piece of furniture she had built in years, and she had built it from clearance items and borrowed tools in a building she had bought for $6. When it was done, it was a table that would hold. The letter from the County Code Enforcement Office arrived on a Wednesday in the first week of January. Eleanor read it at the kitchen table. The county had noted that the property at the Hadley Road address had occupants. They were sending an inspector for a full code compliance assessment, structural integrity, electrical systems, plumbing. Occupancy standards, fire egress. If the property did not meet code, the building would be condemned. Occupants would be required to vacate. 30 days. Walt dried his hands on a dish towel and came to read over her shoulder. He read it through without speaking. Maya had gone still at the sink. Eleanor's hands were flat on the letter. She thought about the 2 spots on the ceiling she had patched but not properly repaired. The second-floor bathroom with no running water. The staircase with 2 cracked treads. 3 windows on the second floor with no glass. She thought about what they had built in 2 months with $67 and a coffee can of inherited hardware, and a town that had begun quietly and without announcement to pay attention. She looked up at Walt. "Then we've got 30 days. We better get to work." Ray Hobbs came out 2 days later in his truck with a man named Davis, a retired plumber who had sold his business the previous year and had been occupying himself with projects around his property that were running out. Davis looked at the pipe situation in the building with the expression of someone who found the problem genuinely interesting rather than merely large. He pulled a length of pipe from the wall in the second-floor bathroom, examined the corrosion pattern, and started making a list in a small notebook he kept in his breast pocket. 2 weekends, he told Eleanor. Maybe 3. Gene came back with his son-in-law, who knew electrical code thoroughly and from the inside. They spent a Saturday running wire to the second floor and installing junction boxes that would pass inspection. Eleanor rebuilt the 2 cracked stair treads using hardwood she pulled from a section of original flooring in the back room that was sound enough to sacrifice fitting the new treads with drawbar pegs instead of screws because the technique was older than code and stronger than either. She reinforced the stair railing by cutting mortise pockets into the newel posts and resetting the balusters with wood glue and clamps. A job that required her to sit on the staircase for 4 hours while the glue set which her knee made memorable. Dylan turned out to be useful in ways that surprised everyone, including Dylan. He could follow instruction precisely, had good spatial awareness, and did not complain about tasks that were awkward or cold. Eleanor put him to work installing weather stripping on every door in the building, a job that required patience and attention to fit, but not advanced skill. And he moved through it with a methodical focus that reminded Walt of certain students he had known, children who had learned to make themselves invisible and quiet, but whose minds were constantly working. Walt began leaving books in Dylan's room. He did not mention it. The books began disappearing. Maya painted the corridor walls during the 3rd week with paint Helen had organized from a collection drive at the church. a warm cream color that absorbed the electric light differently than bare stone and made the hallway feel less like a corridor and more like a passage between rooms where people lived. She painted the lower sections, moving slowly and carefully with one hand on the wall for balance, and Dylan painted above her reach without being asked. The hardest problem was the fire egress. The second floor had no exterior exit, which meant that in a fire, anyone upstairs had only the main staircase. Eleanor spent 2 days working through the options before arriving at the only solution that was both structurally sound and achievable, with what she had: an exterior steel staircase bolted to the south wall, descending from the second floor window to the ground. She sketched the design, calculated the load requirements, identified the connection points, and called Ray. Ray arrived the following morning with a cutting torch and a welder, and stock steel pulled from behind his shop material left over from fabrication jobs over the years. He set up in the exercise yard and told Eleanor what he had brought and what she would need to do with it. She had never welded, but she had brazed copper fittings in plumbing work and understood heat control and joint preparation. And Ray spent an hour showing her technique on scrap pieces before she moved to the actual work. She built the staircase over 4 days. The first day her welds were ugly but sound. By the fourth day they were better than sound. Walt came out each morning with coffee and sat on the limestone block near the yard wall. Not talking, just present. And she worked while the cold air came off the fields to the north, and the smell of flux and hot metal mixed with the smell of the turned earth in the garden beds Walt had prepared along the south wall. She did not ask him to stay. He did not ask permission to be there. The arrangement did not require words. On the third evening after Dylan had gone inside, and Clarence had finished the last of his coffee, and the exercise yard had emptied to just the two of them, Ray set down his cup and looked at the staircase taking shape against the wall. "I spent 30 months in places I don't talk about," he said. "A long time ago. When I came home, I thought the hard part was behind me. Took me years to understand that the hardest thing wasn't what happened over there. It was figuring out that I couldn't carry it alone." He was quiet for a moment. A good carpenter doesn't tear down what's broken. She figures out what it's supposed to be. Eleanor looked at him across the yard. She did not ask how he knew that phrase, the one she had used 3 weeks ago while they were sorting lumber at his store counter. She just looked at him in the evening light and understood that some people paid attention to what mattered and carried it with them without making a ceremony of it. "See you tomorrow," Ray said, and went home. On the fourth day, when the staircase was finished and she had ground the wood smooth and tested every connection, by putting her weight on the structure in multiple positions, she stood back and looked at it in the failing light. It was not elegant. It was exactly what it needed to be, which in Eleanor's understanding of the work was the definition of good. The phone call from Brandon came on a Thursday evening during the third week of the 30-day window. Walt was at the kitchen table reviewing the inspection checklist against what had been completed when the prepaid phone Ray had given them rang. He looked at the number. He recognized the area code from Brandon's city. He answered. Brandon's voice had the particular quality of someone who had spent time constructing what he was about to say. "Walt, I've been hearing things from people in town. I want to help. I can have my attorney look at the licensing situation, and we have 30 days, Brandon." Walt's voice was quiet, not cold, but definite in the way of a man who had finished being managed. "We're working." "I understand that, but the liability exposure alone—" "We are working," Walt said again. "If you want to help, come help. Bring work clothes." A pause. "Don't call this number again unless you mean it." He ended the call and set the phone on the table. Eleanor was at the counter with her back to him, sorting hardware into a tin. She had heard. "Who was that?" Walt looked at the phone for a moment. Then he picked up his pen and went back to the checklist. "Wrong number," he said. The morning of the inspection, Eleanor was up before 5. She tested every light switch on both floors. She opened and closed every window. She ran water in both bathrooms and waited for pressure to stabilize. She went out to the exterior staircase in the cold January dark and stood on each tread and gripped the railing and felt it hold. She came back inside and stood in the corridor for a moment, looking at the length of it, at the cream-colored walls and the wooden doors and the rugs covering the high-traffic sections of the concrete floor. Walt had made coffee by the time she came back to the kitchen. Maya was already awake, sitting at the long table with her hands around a mug, 8 months along now. Clarence came in dressed in the collared shirt he wore for occasions he considered formal. Dylan appeared in the kitchen doorway in a clean hoodie, standing in the posture of someone trying to appear less nervous than he was. They ate breakfast together without talking much about what was coming. At 9:15, a white sedan appeared at the far end of the gravel road, trailing a plume of dust behind it. Walt was the first to see it from the front window. Eleanor was already beside him. Neil Cartwright was in his mid-50s, with the methodical bearing of someone who had been inside enough buildings to have developed an instinct for their character before he checked a single box on his clipboard. He got out of his car and stood for a moment looking at the building from the driveway, the way Eleanor had stood looking at it the first afternoon, taking its measure from the outside before committing to an opinion. Eleanor went out to meet him. She crossed the gravel in the cold morning air and extended her hand. "Eleanor Marsh, my husband Walt is inside. Welcome to our home." Cartwright shook her hand and looked at the building again. Then he looked at her hand and made no comment and clicked his pen. "Shall we go inside?" He stepped through the front entrance and stopped. He stood in the corridor for a full 10 seconds without moving his clipboard at his side, his pen uncapped but not touching paper. The corridor was clean and lit and warm. The ceiling fixtures ran straight and true. The rugs defined the space without cluttering it. He began to walk. Eleanor followed a few steps behind. Walt moved alongside Cartwright, pointing out the fire extinguisher mounted near the stairwell. The smoke detectors in every room and hallway. The clearly marked exit routes posted at each end of the corridor.
This is just
Cartwright
lovely,
looked
isn't
at each
it?
item
It
and
is, to
wrote.
good friends.
He opened the
And
first
good
door on the right and
times.
looked into the room. A bed frame with a real mattress donated in early December. A shelf unit built into the wall. A curtain on the window. He looked at the door itself, at the latch mechanism on the interior face, and he opened and closed
Oh,
it
my
twice.
love, you haven't
He
changed a
moved
bit.
to the next room.
I can still
Each
see that
one was
sparkle
different
in
from
your
the last in
eyes.
ways specific to whoever lived in it. One had a low bed frame and extra shelf space at accessible height. One had a rocking chair in the corner. One had an infant's crib in cherry-stained pine, empty, but waiting with a pair of small shoes on the shelf above it that had not been worn yet. He spent a long time in the kitchen. He looked at the counter Eleanor had built, at the donated range and refrigerator, at the shelves of dry goods organized by type at the window above the sink, where Walt had hung bundles of herbs from the garden to dry. He looked at the long table and the 8 chairs and the evidence of people who ate together every day, the coffee rings and the knife marks and the particular patina of a surface that was used. "How many residents?" he asked. And Walt told him 12, not counting themselves. And Cartwright wrote something that took longer to write than the number would account for. They went upstairs. Cartwright tested the handrail which held without movement. He pressed on each stair tread. He checked the outlets in every second-floor room. He ran the shower in the upstairs bathroom and waited for hot water and checked the pressure. He opened a window in the room at the end of the hall and leaned out to look at the exterior staircase, then went back downstairs and out through the side door to examine it from the ground. Eleanor came out and stood a few feet back while he worked through the structure. He crouched at the base and looked at the anchor bolts going into the limestone. He stood and gripped the handrail and shook it. He put his weight on the first tread and bounced once, testing the deflection. He took a small flashlight from his pocket and examined one of the weld joints at close range, the light moving slowly across the surface of the bead. He stood up and clicked the flashlight off. "Who fabricated this?" He was looking at the staircase, not at her. "I did." He turned and looked at her. He looked at her the way people sometimes looked when they had expected one thing and received another, and were adjusting their understanding of the space between those 2 points. He crouched again and looked at the weld for another moment, then stood and wrote on his clipboard. When they came back to the front entrance and stood on the porch, Cartwright spent 3 minutes going through his notes. Eleanor's hands were in her jacket pockets. Walt stood beside her. Behind them, through the open front door, they could hear Maya moving in the kitchen, and Clarence's voice saying something low, and Dylan's one-word answer. Cartwright looked up from his notes. "Mrs. Marsh, I want to be direct with you. I drove out here this morning with the expectation of condemning this property. The county record shows it as uninhabitable since 1997. Eleanor held his gaze. It was uninhabitable. We fixed it. You did considerably more than fix it. He read through what he had listed as compliant, which took longer than the list of concerns. His electrical notation was positive. His plumbing assessment was positive. His structural evaluation used the word sound 4 times. When he reached the items requiring attention, there were 3: a ventilation fan for the second-floor bathroom, an exterior handrail for the front steps, and a carbon monoxide detector within 10 feet of the wood-burning stove in the common room. "I can have all 3 of those addressed within the week," Eleanor told him. "I'll file this as conditionally compliant. 30 days for the 3 items, then a follow-up." He looked at the building one more time. "I came here to shut this place down," he said, and there was something in his voice that had not been there earlier in the morning. "I can't." He shook Eleanor's hand and walked back to his car. Before he reached it, he turned around. "Mrs. Marsh, the doors in those rooms, they all latch from the inside." Eleanor looked at him across the gravel. "In a jail," she told him, "the doors lock from the outside. This isn't a jail anymore." Cartwright stood at his car door for a moment looking at her, and then at the building, and then he got in and started the engine and drove away down the gravel road. Eleanor and Walt stood on the porch until the dust settled, and the sound of his engine was gone, and there was nothing left but the January air and the sound of the building behind them. Walt put his hand on her shoulder. We passed. Eleanor stood there a moment longer. She allowed herself 3 breaths of cold air before she turned toward the door. "Get the list," she said. "We've got 3 items. The ventilation fan and the handrail and the carbon monoxide detector were finished by Friday. Ray came out with the materials Thursday morning, and Eleanor installed all 3 before Ray's truck had reached the end of the gravel road on his way back. When Cartwright returned 2 weeks later for the follow-up, he spent 12 minutes in the building, checked the 3 items with the systematic brevity of someone who already knew what he would find. Signed. The compliance certificate shook Eleanor's hand again and drove away. The other story, the one that did not have a government form attached to it, had already begun. Rebecca Salt was a reporter for the county paper, a twice-weekly publication that covered school board meetings and county commission votes. She had been at the courthouse on an unrelated errand when she noticed the compliance filing for the Hadley Road address. And the combination of former county jail residential occupancy and 2-person household had produced in her the particular alertness of someone who recognizes a story before she knows what the story is. She drove out on a Wednesday afternoon in February with a camera and a notepad. Walt opened the door and invited her in. He poured coffee and sat across from her at the long table and answered her questions in the deliberate, organized way of a man who had spent decades making complex things accessible to people who needed to understand them. Eleanor came in from the workshop, shook Rebecca's hand, and went back to the workshop. Clarence talked about the garden. Maya came out of her room, briefly spoke for a few minutes, and returned. Dylan stayed in his room until Walt knocked and asked him to come out. And then he sat at the end of the table and answered questions in single sentences, and looked relieved when Rebecca moved on. The article ran the following Sunday. Front page. The photograph showed the corridor, the light running the length of it, the wooden doors, the rugs, and Eleanor's long table in the background with coffee cups on it. Within 48 hours, the article had been shared in numbers that the county paper's website had never recorded before, and then shared again. And by the following weekend, 3 television stations had called the prepaid phone, and a journalist from a wire service had driven 4 hours and arrived at the gravel road in a rental car. Eleanor did 2 interviews. In both of them, she answered questions in the same unadorned way. She described structural problems, stating what was there and what had been done about it and why. When the morning show producer from a national network called and described the segment length and what they were hoping she would say, on camera, Eleanor handed the phone to Walt. He managed it with the patience he had brought to 35 years of parents who wanted complicated things explained simply. He was good at it. He did not allow them to make the story something it was not. The donations that came after the coverage were different in scale from what had come before. Not bags of groceries and extra blankets. Though those continued, but checks from people in other states, gift cards, materials. A lumber company in the next county called Ray and arranged a delivery. A retired architect who had read the wire service piece drove out on a Saturday and spent the day walking the building with Eleanor, sketching as they went. Eleanor spent an evening with the drawings, correcting 2 details the architect had not caught, and making 3 notes in the margins, and sent them back with Ray with a message that said the work was good and she would start Monday. Walt was the one who sat with the money. He had managed their household finances for 40 years, and he brought the same methodical honesty to the donation funds, keeping a ledger in a composition notebook, noting every amount and source and how it was spent. When Eleanor expressed discomfort with the scale of what was coming in, Walt put the ledger on the table between them. "We didn't ask for the first blankets either," he told her, "or the eggs or Jean's work or Ray's credit. We did what was in front of us to do and people responded. What matters is that we use it for exactly what it's for and nothing else." A lawyer in the county seat offered to handle the nonprofit registration without a fee. Walt filled out the forms at the kitchen table with his reading glasses on and a cup of tea at his elbow, the same reading glasses that had been packed in the suitcase on the first morning at the motel. They registered as the Open Door Community Home. After the registration cleared, a foundation in the state capital sent a check that covered the building's insurance for a year. A congregation donated commercial kitchen equipment. The county extended water and sewer connections to the building at no cost, which solved a problem Eliana had been circling for months without finding an affordable path through it. She used the donated lumber to finish the second floor properly, working through February and into March. Insulation between the joists. Drywall on the interior faces of the limestone walls properly fastened and taped. Lighting fixtures that distributed light evenly. Each room on the second floor received a window that opened and locked a bed with a real mattress, a small closet and a door with a lock that the person inside controlled. By the time she finished, the building had 14 rooms and 10 of them were occupied. Rose was born on a Tuesday in March at the county hospital 15 miles away, 6 pounds 9 ounces, arriving at 2:47 in the morning. After Eleanor had driven Ray's truck through the dark, at a speed that represented the only time in her adult life she had ignored a posted limit. Walt sat with Maya through the labor, holding her hand, talking her through contractions the way he talked children through hard things, steadily and without panic, keeping his voice at the level that meant everything was manageable. Eleanor was in the hallway with coffee from the vending machine, and she was not sitting down. When the nurse brought word that it was done and both of them were fine, Eleanor set the paper coffee cup on the plastic chair and did not pick it up again. She went into the room and looked at Maya holding the infant against her chest, with the careful totality of someone who had arrived somewhere she had not known she was going until she got there. Eleanor looked at the baby's face, red and new and absolutely specific, and she said nothing. She stayed for 4 minutes, and then she went back to the hallway. Walt came out after her and stood beside her. "She's good," he said. Eleanor nodded. In her jacket pocket, her hand had already found a pencil and was thinking about dimensions. She had built 3 cribs in her life, one for each of her children, and the crib she built for Rose was better than those 3. She used cherry-stained pine that Ray had set aside for her when a cabinet order had been cancelled. And she worked the wood for 4 days, running each piece through every stage twice sanding, to a finish that had no roughness left anywhere. A small hand might find it. The slat spacing was to the 1/4 inch. The mattress platform adjusted to 2 heights with a mechanism she designed herself, simpler than the commercial versions and more reliable. When she set it in Maya's room and stepped back to look at it, she stood there with the expression she had when something had come out exactly as it should. Dylan passed his GED in May with a 92nd percentile score in reading. Walt put the results on the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a ruler, one of several he had carried in a box through every move since retirement. He had been tutoring Dylan every morning before breakfast for 4 months, covering the same material he had taught hundreds of times in different configurations, adjusting his approach to the specific shape of Dylan's understanding rather than to any standard template. When Dylan came to the kitchen with the envelope and stood at the counter without opening it, Walt turned off the stove and waited. "I'm scared," Dylan said, and Walt did not dismiss the fear or rush past it. "I know, open it anyway." Dylan read the results and looked up with an expression Walt recognized from decades of teaching. The look of a person who has just received evidence that contradicts the story they have been telling themselves about their own capacity. It was the most valuable thing Walt knew how to produce in a person, and he had never found a shortcut to it. He put the results on the refrigerator. Then, "What do you want to do next?" Dylan looked out the window toward the workshop where Eleanor was running a board through the table saw, and his answer when it came was not a surprise to Walt, though it would have surprised Dylan to know it was not building trades. "I think I want to study building trades." Walt told him he would write a recommendation that he had 5 months of daily observation to draw on and had things to say. Dylan enrolled at the community college that fall. Ray found him a car. Brandon came back on a Saturday in late February after the article had run. His SUV was the same and his clothes were the same, and his shoes were wrong for the gravel road in the same way they had been wrong 8 months earlier. Eleanor was in the workshop when she heard the engine. She came out and stood at the workshop door and watched him cross the gravel. They sat at the longer table. Walt made coffee and sat at the end. Brandon looked around the kitchen with his eyes moving in the systematic pattern Eleanor had seen in him since his early 20s. The quick, comprehensive scan of a man whose profession had trained him to assess space in terms of what it represented. She recognized it the way she recognized any habitual gesture in someone she had known for decades, and she let him do it, and then she told him what she saw him doing. Brandon stopped. He looked at the table surface for a moment, then back at her. He came prepared with reasons, liability, exposure, licensing requirements. Occupancy code, the risk to them personally if anything went wrong under their roof. He spoke in the language of his professional life, the language of managed exposure and mitigated risk. And it was not a dishonest language, but it was not the only language available for the situation. And Eleanor waited until he had finished. 5 months, she said. Not one call, not one check on whether we were alive. Her voice was level, not cold, not theatrical level, in the way of someone describing a structural condition that was simply true. You left us at a motel with 2 suitcases and drove away, and you did not call, and we sat in that room and watched the money go, and you did not call. Brandon pressed his lips together. Walt watched him reading the way he had always read the people in his life, and what he read in Brandon's face in that moment was not the practiced reasonableness of the man who had arrived in their kitchen in March, but something underneath it that had been there for months and had been carefully managed. Guilt. Genuine guilt, the kind that does not perform itself but sits quietly in the body and costs something every day. I don't know how to fix this, Brandon said, and his voice had changed registers without his seeming to notice. Eleanor put her hand flat on the table on the wood she had smoothed and sealed. "This isn't broken," she said. "This is built. There's a difference." The silence at the table had a quality that was honest in the way that only silence after a true thing has been said can be honest. Brandon looked at his hands. He offered eventually to have his attorney look at the non-profit structure. Walt accepted the offer without warmth or coldness. Eleanor said nothing more. Brandon left. He sat in his car at the end of the gravel road for a time, the engine off, and then he started it and drove away. He did not come back after that. Eleanor had said what was true, and she had meant what she said, and she did not hate him, but she stopped holding space for a call that was not coming. And the release of that particular waiting was its own form of something she had not expected. Tyler called every Sunday evening from the West Coast. He asked about the garden and about the residents and about what Eleanor was building that week. And he sent money every month to Walt's account without explanation. He had gone quiet once and come back, and offered nothing about the time in between. And Eleanor had asked for nothing, because he was here now, and here was what mattered. Diane came in June with her 2 children, a boy of 9 and a girl of 7. And she sat in her minivan at the end of the gravel road for long enough that Walt, watching from the kitchen window, understood that something important was happening in the car, and that the right response was to stay where he was. When she came in, she stood in the corridor with a child on each side and looked at the building that had been an abandoned jail 8 months earlier. And Eleanor came out of the kitchen with a dish towel over her shoulder, and they looked at each other across the corridor's length, and neither of them spoke first. The children absorbed the afternoon. The boy went with Eleanor to the workshop, and she put a piece of scrap pine in the vise and showed him how to pull a handsaw through a cut line standing close, her scarred hands steady on his shoulders, guiding without gripping. The girl helped Clarence in the garden. Walt made lemonade. The afternoon had the quality of time that is doing more than one thing at once. The ordinary surface of a pleasant afternoon, and underneath it, the more serious work of people finding out whether they can still reach each other across something that was broken. After lunch, Eleanor walked Diane through every room. They went slowly, and Eleanor told her about each person who lived there, where they had come from, what they had lost, what they were making now. When they reached the room that Eleanor and Walt had made from the first cell they had converted, Diane stopped in the doorway and looked at the bed, the curtain that had started as a strip of suitcase lining the photograph of 2 people in borrowed clothes on the shelf. "This was a cell," Diane said. It was. Diane put her hand on the doorframe. Her voice was careful in the way of someone who has prepared what they need to say and is committed to saying it accurately. "I knew what Brandon was planning. Before he drove to your house in March, I knew. And I knew he wasn't going to call. I could see it in everything he didn't say." She stopped. I didn't stop him. I told myself he was handling it. I let him make the decision for all of us because it was easier than the fight. She pressed her forehead against the doorframe. I knew, and I looked away. Eleanor looked at her daughter. She had read faces for a long time. And she had seen this face doing this work before, the work of carrying something that was genuinely heavy without collapsing under it. "I know," she said. "I saw it in your eyes that morning when you were standing in our kitchen. You already knew what was coming, and you were ashamed, and I read it then, and I know it now." Diane's breath caught. "I'm not going to tell you it didn't happen," Eleanor said. "It happened, and it cost something, and it still does. But you're here." She looked at her daughter, at the daughter she had raised in the 4-bedroom house on Barker Street, who had stood behind Brandon in the kitchen and not spoken, and who had driven here in June with her children and sat in the car working up the nerve to come inside. "That's not nothing. That's a start." She let Diane stand with what she had said. She did not reach for her or move to end the difficulty of the moment, because the difficulty was honest. And honesty had always been what Eleanor had to offer instead of comfort. After a while, Diane straightened and wiped her face and asked if she could come back, could bring the children again, could be a regular presence rather than a visitor. Eleanor told her the door was open. It had always been open. Diane started coming every 2 weeks through the summer and into fall. She brought supplies and participated in whatever the household needed, and sat with Eleanor in the workshop on Sunday afternoons the way she had sat on job sites as a child, watching her mother work without needing to talk. The boy came back and learned to use a handsaw, then a chisel, then a mallet. Eleanor taught him the way she had taught herself, through the hand before the explanation. By October, the building held 16 people, in addition to Eleanor and Walt, and the Open Door Community Home had become the kind of resource that a county depends on without fully accounting for the place the social services office called. First, the address the pastor gave to families who needed somewhere before the waiting list cleared. Eleanor was 77, and her body had opinions about the work that it had not had before. Her left knee measuring the cold in its particular way, her grip less absolute on cold mornings than it had been. She worked anyway because working was how she understood the world, and the world still needed understanding. On an October evening, a year and 2 weeks after she and Walt had laid down on the concrete floor for the first night, a car pulled to the end of the gravel road and 2 people got out. They stood at the edge of the property for a long time before beginning to walk toward the building, and Walt saw them from the kitchen window and recognized the quality of their hesitation. The hesitation of people who need something and are calculating the cost of admitting it. He went out to meet them. The woman spoke first, explaining what had happened in the direct abbreviated way of someone describing a situation too large for the words available. Their son's city apartment, the changed locks, the unanswered phone. She stopped and looked at the building. Her husband stood beside her, holding a single bag, his free hand at his side, carrying himself with the careful dignity of a man who has not yet surrendered to what has happened to him. Walt looked at them. He did not need to ask anything more. He had stood where they were standing, on gravel outside a building he did not know, with everything reduced to what he and the person beside him could carry. "Come inside," he said. "I'll put the kettle on." Eleanor came out of the workshop, her hands bearing the evidence of the day's work, and she saw Walt holding the door for 2 people with a single bag between them. And she went to the kitchen and washed her hands and took 2 bowls from the shelf without being asked. That evening, there were 18 people at the long table. Eleanor said a few words before they ate, not a speech. She did not make speeches, just the thing that was true. "A year ago, Walt and I had 2 suitcases and $6, and we didn't know what we were doing. Most days we still don't." A small laugh moved around the table. "But we know one thing. We didn't rescue anyone here. We just left the door open. Everyone at this table rescued themselves." She sat down. Walt reached under the table and took her hand. After dinner, they sat on the porch in the 2 chairs she had built from reclaimed oak in July, the chairs that fit the specific dimensions of the view from the front of the building, the gravel road and the field beyond it, and the October sky going dark in the west. Walt took the photograph from his breast pocket and held it between them on the arm of his chair. They sat with it in the cooling air, the sound of the household behind them moving through the stone walls in pieces, a laugh from the kitchen, and the low register of Clarence's voice, and somewhere upstairs Rose making the sound she made when she was not unhappy but wanted someone to know she was awake. Eleanor looked at the building's south face, where the morning glories had climbed the iron bars of the ground floor windows all summer, winding through the metal in the particular way that living things found their way through structures that were designed to stop them. The flowers were long gone, and the vines had thinned, but the stems still held wrapped around the iron, and in the evening light from the windows behind them, the bars did not look like bars anymore. They looked like something a garden had decided to use. "We look so certain," Walt said, looking at the photograph. "Were we right?" Eleanor looked at the building, at the lights in every window, at the tended yard and the covered porch, and the sign by the front entrance that said what it said. She thought about a $5 bill and a coffee can of inherited nails, and the specific sound of a bubble finding true in a level someone had left behind 30 years ago. She thought about a strip of burgundy fabric tied across iron in the dark. "We were right about the only thing that mattered," she said. Walt set the photograph on the arm of the chair between them, where they could both see it without reaching. Behind them, the door was open. It always was.